I am a certified sex therapist. I have certifications in EMDR, which is a eye movement reprocessing therapy. I also have a lot of trauma background as well as couples therapy background, and I'm currently working on doing more psychedelic therapy. I've been probably working as a sex therapist since 2014, so almost 10 years currently, but probably like officially certified more so like 7, 8 years.
Is there, are there any recurrent themes or blocks that you see in your clients in regards to them living a full and sexually healthy life? Like, are there just a few things that seem to come up often?
I mean, I think that's a good question. For me, I look at everything, whether it is sex related, trauma related, it all kind of comes down to culture. So I would say that typically, regardless of what the issue is, a lot of it is impacted by whatever the culture is placed on it. So if someone's having penis issues like erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, it's the themes of I'm not good enough, or I'm no longer a man enough, or I'm no longer this, because our culture has placed like sex is this big thing that everybody has to be high performing at, and it has to be great all the time, and it has to be this way, and it has to be that way. There's all these has tos or must or perfectionism that I think really impacts the way people function in their sexuality and how they show up. Because it's like, for me, the way I look at it is you can be someone that is very provocative in your presentation. You can be someone who's very conservative in your presentation. And what you do in your bedroom can look a multitude of different ways. But based on our culture, if you look this way, you're going to be this way in bed. And if you look this way, you're going to be that way in bed. And there's not really a place for a multi-dimensional space for people to be open and be able to show up however they choose to and be accepted. So I would say that's pretty much probably the biggest encapsulating theme that I see when clients see me, whether it's for infidelity, whether it's for, like I said, pain during intercourse or penis issues or vulva issues. It still all boils down to their perception based on what culture has placed on them.
How would you define sexual wellness?
Um, It's interesting. The first word that comes to my mind is sex positivity, is sexual wellness, because I look at sex positivity as being accepting of all different forms of sexuality and how that presents. Also, being able to talk to your healthcare providers about about whatever your sexual concerns are. It's hard because some of our healthcare providers aren't really as um, informed around sexuality as they need to be. Even as physicians, I've actually been someone that does different workshops for physicians, and they only get about 3 clocked hours, if not even that, of sexuality training in their med school programs. So it's like, but you still, regardless of your provider, you still have to be able to advocate for yourself with your providers as well as with your partners, as well as with yourself. Just really seeking pleasure and being able to know that your pleasure should take first place over any, I mean, not, excuse me, I don't want to say first place, because if you're with partners, your partners should care too. You should care about your partners too, but you should be centered on you first, as well as whoever else is in the space with you.
Right. And of course, that person will be centered on themselves. You're centered on yourself while keeping in mind each other's needs. But
Yes.
if all of us took care of ourselves, the whole world would be taken care of, right? Instead of needing other people to do this or do that. Well, of course, we're interconnected and those things are important,
Hmm.
knowing that it is our individual job to make sure that our needs are met first.
Yes. And again, I always like to say that does not mean being selfish. Selfish and self-centered are two different things. So just making sure you're centering you as well as focusing on other people's pleasure. It can be, that is the key to sexual wellness to me. If we're not talking to children about sexuality from the time that they're touching their genitals, or showing them different pieces of what's appropriate touch and what's not from the time that they're born, we're really kind of giving them over. I mean, we're giving a lot of space over to predators, you know, because they don't know how to talk about their bodies. They don't know how to talk about what's good and bad touch. The people who are preying on them are usually people that they care about and who are part of their own community. So it is our jobs from the very beginning to start talking about sex with the youth. Then as we go into more younger adulthood, more intercourse kind of interactions, if we don't focus on everyone understanding what pleasure looks like, we're just looking at pleasure only being centering around the person that the TV makes it look like. And if we look at a lot of pornography, POV, point of view, is usually the male's point of view, right? So it's centered on the male's pleasure. It's not centered on someone with the vulva's pleasure. So if we're not having these conversations, we're really limiting we're really creating spaces for potential harm and damage to a lot of people. And I think in our society we do talk about sex a lot. We excuse me, let me rephrase that. We joke about sex, we make music about sex, we have superficial conversations about sex, but we really aren't having conversations that are in depth and are about really how does someone show up and show up wholly and show up with all their complexities and show up as things change and show up for their own pleasure. Is a very performative space for sex that if we had better conversations, we would be able to reduce a lot of harm and we'd be able to have a lot more acceptance and authenticity in a lot of relationships, not just within our sexual relationships. We live in a society that is very sex negative culturally and politically.
Oh, yeah, that's a really important point. Exactly. That I'm glad you highlighted that there are probably people that want to do more and to say more in a factual, scientific based way, but they're looking at serious consequences for doing so, and so they may not. I think the Kinsey Institute just lost some of its funding.
I wouldn't be surprised, especially since it's in Indiana.
Yeah, from my understanding, they lost some of their funding, which is really unfortunate because they are doing such incredible research around sexuality and sex, that bringing information that we just don't have because no one's really had the dedication to just focus on that. You know, our understanding of our sexuality is still pretty limited. When you look at what we've researched, we honestly probably might know more about the moon at this point than our own human sexuality.
I mean, you're probably right, unfortunately.
You know, it's interesting because I'm curious, you know, do you have any clients that use cam sites or that are some type of adult entertainer?
I'll say yes to both because I feel like those are two questions. I definitely have clients that use campsites, and I've had clients or have clients currently who are sex workers.
What were some of the pros and cons for your clients that were engaging in campsites?
I think it's a little bit more personalized than actually just watching pornography. So I think that's kind of their reason for going into the campsites, is because you can ask people to do different things. And also, what I know this is probably a hot topic for me to say, but in some ways it's more ethical too. Because usually if you're doing a campsite, you're paying for that service. So whoever's on the campsite, hopefully, you know, there's all kinds of exploitation that's happening, but they're getting some kind of compensation for whatever their activity is, where we know majority of the ones that are on some of these pornography sites are not getting anything. So to some degree, it's a more ethical space as well as this more interactive and personal space. And that's also for the people who are on the sites who are performers. They feel like it's more ethical, and they're not doing it for the personalization as much, but definitely they know they're getting their money directly to them, and they feel like they have more control.
And even physically for them, it's more safe. There's no risk of STIs, STDs, physical harm, or abuse. And one of the things too is, I mean, I can only speak about Live Jasmin because that is the platform that I know and, you know, foundation of this interview. But when you have a very large organization involved to ensure the safety of both the member and the model, there's a certain degree of clarity in the dynamic and relationship that I think makes everyone feel better. The member
Hmm.
understands that he is paying for a very particular service. The model also understands that the member is there for that service. And they both understand that there's a middleman, so to speak, who's going to make sure that they're both safe and taken care of. And so I've definitely heard from several models. That's one of the reasons that I've interviewed a model who used to be an erotic dancer. And she was like, first of all, that can be very tiring. Second of all, it usually does include touch. You are touched by people in the club that are you're giving a lap dance to, or whatever the case is. And she said she just got so tired. And so camming gave her the space to kind of just relax more and be at home.
I think for sex work in general, no matter what it is, at the core, there is a connection piece that people are looking for.
Absolutely. And that's the part that for some reason doesn't get talked about. What gets talked about when it comes to any form of sexual content, sex work, is just sex and the stigma around that, whatever on both sides, whoever's receiving the sex work, whoever's giving it. But no one's talking about the connection piece and the fact that potentially the person paying for services is feeling really lonely. I've had models tell me they had a member who expressed suicidal ideation to them, and they were just needing someone in that moment to feel connected to. We know this is undisputed science that if we do feel lonely, it shaves years off of our life. It's been likened to smoking like 2 packs of cigarettes a day, you know? So that's something that I find interesting is that we only talk about what we would consider the cons or stigma or judgments around sexuality, but we're not talking about some of the underlying reasons that are driving people to campsites or to in-person sex work.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad Kinsey Institute is doing more work around that. In the addiction world, they have a term called HALT. And that means that if you're falling into two or three of these areas, you're probably going to relapse. And if you hit four, you're going to completely relapse. And that is the H stands for hunger, the A stands for angry, the L stands for loneliness, or I also say boredom, and then the T stands for tired. So pretty much when it comes to um, just poor adaptive coping skills. You know, if you're lonely and you're bored, on top of being tired, you're probably going to be falling into something that you don't want to do, whether that's spending more money or eating more or having sex in different ways that you don't want to have sex. So I always I'm just kind of naming that as like another piece of the connection is like a lot of us, especially due to COVID as well as social media as well as video. I mean, I'm not blaming everything on these things because it's not just that, but it's just these things add to our disconnection from one another. Also, the fact that we can move anywhere. Like when I grew up, I knew all my neighbors. I don't know any of my neighbors now, or very few. Let me rephrase that. I do, but that's because of me. Like I'm a person that knows my neighbors. But for most people don't know their neighbors anymore. And that's because our society is really changing when it comes to connection. And that's also creating more addiction and more psychological disorders.
When you said the definition, when you said the definition of HALT, hunger, anger, loneliness, and tiredness, definitely in regards to angry, lonely, and tired, I was like, well, I think you just described 90% of the American population. because a lot of people feel that way. And you're right. I think that we are seeing an increase in really a vast number of different kinds of addictions.
And even with the hunger, like we might not have the same type of hunger issues as other countries, but if you think about like McDonald's, McDonald's is not really nutrition, so it's like when I say even hunger, I'm not talking about just, oh, my stomach is full, but am I really getting nutrients? And a lot of us aren't getting nutrients, and that leads us into other areas of psychological and not being able to perform as well psychologically, mentally, physically, and all those other areas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are we having sex to get a sense of connection that we don't have in some cases generally, or are we giving connection to try and get sex?
I think that answer is dependent on the individuals. So it can go any of the above. I like how you said, are we giving connection? Because that's what people will say is that men will give connection to get sex and women will give sex to give connection is kind of what I've heard in passing. And I think I don't think everybody performs the same way. I think that may be kind of a generality because of how our society has groomed people who are presenting as a woman or presenting as a male is that this is what you need to do in order to get this. But one of the things that someone told me recently that I've really kind of held on to is that a lot of us don't really have a good vetting process. Just 20, 30, 40 plus years ago, you could vet people a little bit clearer than you can now. Like people lived in the same communities, went to the same high schools, or you didn't have to go that far to kind of ask who they dated and how they are as a person. And now it's like we really don't know people like that. And it's easy for people to have different masks in this one space versus this one space versus this next country or state or wherever else they choose to be.
This is biological. There's research around this. It's in our DNA to feel more safe when we have either a partner or someone that we feel, a man in particular that we feel like loves us, because back in the caveman days, our women's survival was based upon being partnered up. And that is still.
And that wasn't that long ago. I mean, not just cavemen. I mean, women just were able to start having their names on homes, just in this late 70s. So some of us, we're just now able to have things of our own, is what I'm trying to say. We've been pretty dependent, even up until like maybe 10 years ago. Even if you wanted to get your tubes tied, you had to get approval from your husband. So those are just things to kind of keep in mind. Like we live in a society that is not very far, if not still ingrained, that our survival is based on the connection of a man.
Absolutely. And those things are in our DNA. And so, there's a lot of researchers who have talked about this. They've said, which I really appreciate, when it comes to women, give them a break when they're needy or naggy or clingy, because a lot of times that's coming from the part of the DNA that's like, oh my goodness, no, I need you to survive. I need you to survive. And because depending on the type of science you believe in, it takes like millions of years to evolve something out of our DNA. So we still have a lot of this present. They were also saying, though, the flip side of that with men, it is still present in men's DNA that they are meant to keep the species alive and to populate the earth. So when men have this urge for variety and to be with a bunch of different women, there actually is a part of them in their DNA that is pushing for that, because it's like an instinct to keep the species. Yeah. And so it's really interesting how the two dynamics play out with each other. One is to cling, the other one is to have variety, and just if we could all have maybe a little bit more compassion for the instincts of the others. Now, we are conscious beings, so we can't completely say that it's just an animalistic instinct. I can't do anything about it. That's also not true when we're talking about human beings. That's what differentiates us, right? We have a consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
can make these choices, but we do also have drives. So it is fair to cut each other a little bit of slack. But yeah, it's just really interesting where some people are at in that need for connection, and to the point where we have people like our members on Live Jasmin that are willing to pay to have their needs met. That is
Mm-hmm.
how much connection and desire and these needs, that's how important they are to an individual. They will pay money for them, or in other cases people will potentially abandon their own beliefs for them or themselves in a dynamic where they can get them, or look the other way on certain things. So fascinating.
What my desire is as a mental health professional is to help people be conscious, so it's like, as long as you're aware, the key is, again, is that self-centeredness, like not selfish, but at least centering what it is that you're getting, and you being having some type of reciprocity in the situation.
Yeah, that awareness. Yeah, I like that. If you could give everyone in the world a message about human sexuality that you don't think they're getting yet or they quite understand yet, what would that message be?
um I think that, I guess the theme of this whole conversation is like, I want people to try to center themselves and know themselves first, and as they seek their own personal pleasure and seeking and understanding how they please others, um, they can have a great sexual life and great personal life in general. It's like the more we kind of are true to us, the more it'll start spreading to other people.
Very well said. My final question for you is, from your experience and your perspective, what are our next steps in moving forward with a more sexually positive, sexually well society?
I think part of it is education, and starting, like I said, from womb to tomb, helping people understand that we need to be having these conversations from the time someone finds out that they're pregnant to, the time someone enters a nursing home. They should be having conversations around their sexuality. I think that would probably be the next step, is really education. And then also, part of the education piece is working through our traumas and working through having better insight for who we are and how we present in this world. So education of self as well as your own sexuality are primary steps.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.